It was just after 8 in the morning when the message came through. I was standing in my small kitchen in the outskirts of Asheville, pouring hot coffee into my favorite blue mug when my phone lit up on the counter. My son's name, Michael, appeared on the screen, and for a moment I felt a little rush of warmth the way I always do when he reaches out. That warmth vanished the second I read the words, "Don't come to my wedding. You're not welcome." I felt my stomach tighten. Before I could even process it, another message came in. "If you show up, the wedding will be canceled." The coffee smelled rich and warm, but my hands had gone cold around the handle. Sunlight streamed in through the window above the sink, glinting off the faucet and spreading across the countertop, but all I could see were those words. My own son, the boy I raised after his father died, shutting me out with the finality of a slammed door. I set the mug down, the sound of ceramic on wood strangely loud in the stillness. I tried to tell myself to breathe, but my mind was already running backward, sliding through years I had worked so hard to hold together. Peter had been gone for 28 years when I was 34, and I had to keep working at the school's finance office to pay the bills while raising Michael. We didn't have much, but we had each other, or at least I thought we did. Now here I was, 62, alone in this quiet house, and my son's voice, even through text, felt colder than the tile under my bare feet. I leaned against the counter and remembered the last time we had spoken face to face. It had been only a few weeks ago, and he had shown up with Natalie, his fiancée. They had come into my living room with their smiles and their expensive coats, talking about the Charleston wedding like it was a royal event. They wanted me to contribute $45,000 to help cover costs and sign over the deed to this house so it could become part of their new future. I told them the truth. I could manage $12,000, and even that would take pulling from my retirement savings. The rest, I said I needed to keep a roof over my head, to keep this home where I had memories of Peter and the life we had built. Natalie's smile had vanished first. She made a little sound, almost like a laugh, and said there was no reason to hold on to an old house when they could have something better. Michael just sat there silent, not defending me, not telling her to stop. When they left, he looked at me and said I'd regret this. I remember standing at the door after they drove away, the sound of the car fading, the air outside colder than it should have been. Now, with his text still open on my phone, I felt that same coldness settle in. I walked over to the table by the window and sat down. The mug of coffee steamed beside me, the sunlight shifting across the floor as the morning moved on. My eyes drifted to the bookshelf in the corner, to a thick leather-bound address book that had been there for years. I reached for it and flipped through the pages until I found the name I was looking for, Rachel Simmons. We hadn't spoken in a long time, but she had been a friend once, before our lives pulled us in different directions. I thought back to the day I helped her catch the discrepancies in a client's books when she was still a young attorney. I had spotted the irregularities immediately, and my advice had saved her from losing a major case. She had told me then that if I ever needed her, all I had to do was call. I had never taken her up on that offer, not until this moment. I closed the book and stared out the window. The bare branches of the maple tree in the yard moved slightly in the wind, their shadows swaying on the lawn. Somewhere down the street a dog barked twice and then went quiet. My heart was steady, not racing. This wasn't about anger. It wasn't about trying to force my way into a wedding where I was unwanted. It was about something colder and sharper. I had a sense that I was standing at the beginning of something I couldn't quite see the end of yet, and the thought didn't scare me. If anything, it settled me. I picked up my phone again and looked at Rachel's name on the screen. My thumb hovered over the call button, and I thought about what Michael had said. I thought about the way Natalie had looked at me like I was a problem to be managed, something to be removed from their picture-perfect life. I thought about the years I had spent making sure Michael had everything he needed, and how quickly he had turned that into a reason to push me aside. The coffee had gone lukewarm, but I took a sip anyway, letting the bitterness steady me. I wasn't going to beg for an invitation or plead for a seat at their table. I was going to find out exactly what kind of people I was dealing with, and I knew just who could help me do that. I set the cup down, pressed the call button, and lifted the phone to my ear. 3 weeks earlier, Michael had stood in my living room, his hands in the pockets of a tailored navy suit that looked like it had just come back from the dry cleaner. Natalie was beside him, her coat draped over her shoulders like she'd stepped out of a glossy magazine. They sat on the edge of my sofa, all polite smiles and careful words at first, but I could feel the weight of what they'd come for before they even said it. Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "We're finalizing the wedding budget, Mom. It's in Charleston at the Harborview Hotel, and we want to make it perfect. We need you to contribute $45,000. Natalie's tone was smooth, almost casual, like she was asking me to pass the salt. And she added it would be best for everyone if you signed the deed to the house over to us now. That way it's secure for our future. For a moment I just stared at them, the words rolling around in my head. This house wasn't just 4 walls and a roof. It was where Peter and I had built our life, where Michael had taken his first steps, where every corner held a memory. I folded my hands in my lap and spoke slowly, trying to keep my voice even. I can give you $12,000, that's what I can manage without jeopardizing my retirement. And the house stays in my name. I need it, Michael. I need my home. Natalie's smile tightened her eyes, flicking to Michael before she leaned back against the cushion. $12,000 is nothing compared to what my family is contributing. You don't need to cling to some old house when we can have something better. Her words had that practiced sweetness that barely covered the sting. I saw Michael's jaw shift, but he didn't correct her, didn't defend me. He just looked at me like this was a negotiation I was losing. I took a breath, hoping he would remember the years when it was just the two of us, how hard I had worked to make sure he never went without. Instead, he stood up, smoothing his jacket, and Natalie followed, adjusting the strap of her designer bag. At the door, Michael paused. "You'll regret this, Mom." The way he said it wasn't angry, just cold, like a decision had been made somewhere far from this living room. The sound of their car pulling away had lingered in the air that afternoon, long after the taillights disappeared down the street. I remember standing there with my hand still on the doorframe, feeling a kind of emptiness I hadn't known since the day Peter died. Now looking back on that moment from the quiet of my kitchen, I realized it had been the first crack in something I thought was unbreakable. I carried my coffee to the sink and poured it out, watching the dark liquid swirl away. The scent of it clung to the air, but it didn't warm me. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the bare branches against the window. I thought about Michael's eyes in that moment, how they had matched Natalie's, aligned against me. There had been no hesitation, no flicker of doubt. The house felt heavier than usual, the silence pressing in around me. I walked into the living room and let my fingers trail along the edge of the mantel where Peter's photograph stood. He was in uniform in that picture, his smile easy, the kind that made you believe things would be all right. I wondered what he would say now, how he would see the son we had raised. I sat down in my armchair, the one by the window that looked out onto the yard, and tried to remember the last time Michael had come here without an agenda. I couldn't. Every visit in recent years had carried some request, some condition. This one had just been the boldest. Somewhere deep down, I think I knew that conversation had been more than just about money or property. It had been a test, and I had failed it in their eyes. But I also knew I couldn't pass it without losing myself, without giving away the last piece of stability I had. And if that meant stepping into whatever storm was coming, then so be it. I stayed there for a long while, watching the afternoon light shift across the lawn, until the sound of the old clock in the hallway pulled me back. It was almost noon, and the day felt like it was just starting. I stood, smoothed the front of my sweater, and went to find that address book. There were calls to make, and I no longer had the luxury of time. I carried the worn leather address book into my small office at the back of the house and set it on the desk. The pages were thin and yellowed, in places ink smudged from years of use, but the names and numbers were still there like old footprints. I flipped past neighbors who had moved away, colleagues I hadn't spoken to in decades, until my finger stopped on the one I'd been thinking about all morning. Rachel Simmons. I picked up the phone before I could second-guess myself and dialed the number. It rang twice. Then a warm but cautious voice answered, "Eleanor, I haven't heard from you in forever. What's going on?" Hearing her say my name brought back the memory of when we first met, both of us younger, sharper, standing over stacks of financial records in a cramped conference room. She had been fighting to keep her case from collapsing under the weight of bad bookkeeping, and I had spotted the errors in minutes. She had said then that I'd saved her career. "Rachel, I need your help," I said, and I didn't bother trying to soften my tone. I told her about Michael, about the wedding in Charleston, about Natalie and her family. I told her I suspected that the Whitford luxury group wasn't what they appeared to be. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that feels like it stretches just a little too long. "I've heard whispers about them," Rachel said finally. "Hotels, spas, a lot of cash flow that doesn't match their filings. Nothing concrete, but it's enough to make people curious." I leaned forward in my chair, my hand gripping the armrest. "How quickly could you find something more than whispers?" She didn't hesitate. "Give me 5 days. I'll pull public records, court filings, property transfers, and I have a few contacts who owe me favors. It won't be free, though. $3,000 for a deep dive." I didn't even flinch. "I'll get it to you this afternoon." "Rachel, I need this done right." She let out a slow breath. "You'll have to be ready for whatever I find, Eleanor. Sometimes the truth makes things messier before it makes them better." I knew she was right, but I'd already stepped past the point of turning back. We worked out the details quickly. I'd send the payment electronically, and she'd start within the hour. When we hung up, I sat for a moment staring at the phone in my hand. $3,000 was no small sum for me now, but it felt less like a cost and more like an investment in knowing exactly who I was up against. I pulled open the desk drawer and took out the folder where I kept my savings account information. The pen felt heavy in my hand as I filled out the transfer form online, double-checking each number before pressing submit. A confirmation message popped up, and with it came a strange mix of relief and unease. There was no undoing this now. Outside, the wind was stronger, pushing clouds across the pale blue sky. I stood at the window for a moment, watching the shadows chase each other across the yard. In my mind, I replayed Rachel's voice when she'd said she'd heard whispers. It made me wonder just how deep those whispers went and how long people had been ignoring them. I left the office and walked back into the kitchen, the smell of the coffee still faint in the air. I poured myself a fresh cup and leaned against the counter. The house was quiet, but my thoughts were loud, full of images I didn't want to see but couldn't push away. Michael, in a tailored suit. Natalie with her perfect hair and cold smile, a ballroom full of people who thought they knew who we were. I wondered what they'd say if they knew what Rachel might uncover. My phone buzzed on the counter, and for a second my heart jumped, but it was only a notification confirming the transfer had gone through. I took another sip of coffee, feeling the warmth spread through me this time. Rachel was out there now, starting to pull on the threads. All I had to do was wait, and I'd never been good at waiting. The clock in the hallway chimed once, the sound echoing through the house. I set the mug down and picked up a notepad from the drawer. If Rachel was going to dig, I could too. I wrote down everything I knew about the Whitfords, every scrap of conversation I could remember from Michael, every detail about the wedding plans they'd mentioned. I listed the names of people in town who might have crossed paths with them, even briefly. By the time I put the pen down, the page was nearly full. I read it over, tapping the pen against the desk, and felt a slow, steady resolve settle in my chest. I had set something in motion now, something I couldn't stop even if I wanted to. I didn't know exactly where it would end, but I knew it would take me closer to the truth than I'd ever been. The next morning, I was out in the front yard, trimming back the overgrown hedges, when I saw Linda Cooper walking up the sidewalk, her knit scarf pulled tight against the chill. She had that look she got when she was holding on to something she couldn't wait to share. I set down the clippers and wiped my hands on my jeans as she stopped at the gate. "Have you heard?" she asked, her voice dropping as if the hedges might be listening. "The Whitford wedding is all anyone's talking about at the coffee shop this week. They're calling it the wedding of the century here in Asheville." I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice even. "I've heard some things." Linda leaned in a little, her breath clouding in the cold air. "People are saying you're not invited, and some of them, well, they think maybe it's for the best." "For the best," I repeated, feeling the words sink in. She nodded quickly as if she hadn't meant to say it out loud. You know how people can be? There's talk about how different your life is from theirs, how you might not feel comfortable in that crowd. I could hear the careful way she was trying to say it, but the meaning was sharp enough. Not their kind of people. Not good enough. I stood there for a moment watching a leaf drift across the driveway. I had spent my entire adult life making sure Michael never felt less than anyone else, and now I was the one being measured and found lacking. Linda shifted uncomfortably, and then seemed to remember something. Oh, and I heard a name you might be interested in. Thomas Blake. Used to work for Whitford Luxury Group. Got fired suddenly last year. Someone said it was because he knew too much. The name stuck in my head instantly. What did he do for them, I asked. She shrugged. Something to do with contracts. I don't know all the details, but I do know he's back in town staying with his sister on Cedar Street. If anyone would have something real to say about that family, it'd be him. I thanked her, and she gave me a quick pat on the arm before heading off down the sidewalk. I went back inside the warmth of the house, wrapping around me, but it didn't chase away the chill that had settled in my chest. The coffee pot was still half full from earlier, so I poured a cup and took it to the table. I wrote Thomas Blake's name at the top of a fresh page in my notepad and underlined it twice. The rest of the day, I kept hearing Linda's voice in my head. People are saying you're not invited. They think maybe it's for the best. It wasn't just gossip, it was a way of putting me outside the circle, of making it clear that whatever was about to happen in Charleston had nothing to do with me. I had been erased, and they were all too comfortable with it. By late afternoon, the light was starting to fade, and I couldn't sit still any longer. I pulled my coat from the closet, slid my notepad into the pocket, and stepped out into the cold. The wind carried the smell of wood smoke from somewhere nearby, and the sky had that washed-out color it gets before the first real frost. I walked down the block, my boots crunching over the last of the autumn leaves, and turned toward Cedar Street. I didn't plan to knock on Thomas's door that night. I just wanted to see the house, to know he was real, that he was here. The neighborhood was quiet, porch lights flickering on one by one as the daylight drained away. I spotted the address Linda had given me, a small white house with a pickup parked in the driveway. There was a light on in the front room, and for a moment I imagined what it might be like to walk up, introduce myself, and ask questions he might not be ready to answer. Instead, I kept walking, looping back toward home. I needed to think about how to approach him without spooking him. People who leave jobs under bad circumstances don't usually open up to strangers, and if what Linda had hinted at was true, Thomas might have more to lose than I realized. When I got back to my house, I pulled off my coat and sat down at the desk again. I added Thomas's name to the growing list of leads and wrote a few notes about what I might ask him. My pen hovered for a moment before I added one more line. If he refuses, find another way in. The clock in the hallway chimed 6. Outside, the street was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every small sound stand out. Somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed and a dog barked once before going silent. I looked down at the notepad at the names and details I had been collecting and felt the resolve settle in again. This wasn't just about proving I belonged. It was about making sure they knew I couldn't be pushed out so easily. The next afternoon, I called the number Linda had given me for Thomas Blake. His sister answered, her voice cautious, until I explained who I was and why I wanted to talk. There was a pause, then she said Thomas would meet me, but not at the house. We settled on a small coffee shop downtown, the kind with mismatched chairs and the smell of roasted beans hanging in the air. I arrived early and chose a corner table with a clear view of the door. The cold outside had brought in a steady stream of customers wrapped in scarves and coats, their voices blending into a soft hum. I wrapped my hands around a mug of tea and waited. When Thomas finally walked in, I recognized him immediately from Linda's description. Late 40s, worn leather jacket, the look of someone who had seen too much of certain kinds of work. He spotted me and walked over, his eyes scanning the room before he slid into the seat across from me. "You're Michael's mother," he said. Not quite a question. I nodded. "I heard you used to work for the Whitford Luxury Group. I did. He set his hands flat on the table. And I'm guessing you want to know why I don't anymore. I leaned forward slightly. Only if you're willing to tell me. He let out a short laugh without humor. It's not exactly a bedtime story. I was in their contracts department. On paper, I handled agreements with vendors for their spa and hotel operations. In reality, half those vendors didn't exist. I was told to sign off on invoices for services that were never performed for properties that were never built. The addresses were empty lots, the phone numbers disconnected. He paused long enough to take a sip of the coffee he'd ordered. When I started asking questions, my supervisor told me to mind my own business. A few weeks later, I was called into a meeting, handed a severance package, and escorted out. No explanation, no reference, just gone. My heart sank at how matter-of-fact he sounded, like he'd gone over this story too many times. Do you have anything to prove it? I asked, my voice low. He looked at me for a long moment, weighing something. I kept my gaze steady. Finally, he reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a thin folder. I kept copies of a few things. Emails between executives about pushing through fake contracts, invoices from non-existent companies, a list of payments that went straight into private accounts. I didn't take everything, but I took enough to remind myself I wasn't imagining it. I opened the folder, scanning the pages. The company names, the numbers, the vague descriptions of luxury spa services and resort expansions. It was exactly the sort of thing Rachel had described as suspicious. My fingers tightened slightly on the paper. This matches things I've already heard, I said. It's more than I could have hoped for. Thomas shifted in his seat, his eyes on the door again. I'm giving this to you because you're not a reporter or a cop. If this goes anywhere, you didn't get it from me. I nodded. I'm not looking to drag your name into anything. He pushed the folder toward me. Then it's yours. Use it if you need it. We sat there for another 10 minutes, talking about the little details that didn't make it into the documents, the way upper management avoided email for certain conversations, the expensive dinners paid for in cash, the sudden trips overseas. He spoke quietly, his voice almost lost in the clatter of cups and the hiss of the espresso machine. When we stood to leave, he shook my hand, his grip firm but brief. Good luck, he said, and I thought I heard something like relief in his voice. Outside, the air was sharp with cold, and I tucked the folder under my arm as I walked to my car. The weight of it was both reassuring and heavy, a reminder of what I was stepping into. Back home, I set the folder on my desk beside the notepad where Rachel's name was underlined. The evidence from Thomas lined up perfectly with the rumors Rachel had mentioned. This wasn't just gossip anymore. It was real, and it was in my hands. I sat down, opened the folder again, and began reading every word. 2 days later, Rachel called and asked if I could meet her in person. Her voice had that clipped, deliberate tone she used when she wanted to keep things off the phone. We agreed on a quiet diner just outside of town, the kind where the booths were deep and the servers didn't hover. I got there early and slid into a corner booth, my coat still holding the bite of the cold air outside. Rachel walked in 10 minutes later, her long coat unbuttoned, a thick leather briefcase in her hand. She didn't waste time with small talk. She set the case on the table, clicked it open, and pulled out a thick stack of files bound with a rubber band. I started to reach for them, but she kept her hand on top. Before you read any of this, you need to understand something. These people aren't sloppy. They've built layer upon layer to hide what they're doing. But I found enough cracks to see through. She slid the stack across to me. I pulled off the band and began flipping through the pages. There were articles of incorporation for companies I'd never heard of, all linked to Whitford Luxury Group in one way or another. Each one had a polished name and a professional-looking letterhead, but when I looked at the addresses, most were empty lots or single-family houses nowhere near a commercial district. My eyes caught on invoices for spa services totaling $30,000, $40,000, even $50,000, all billed to properties that didn't exist. Rachel sipped her coffee while I read, letting me take it in at my own pace. The further I went, the more the pattern emerged. Large cash deposits into corporate accounts, always just under the threshold that would require reporting. Transfers between subsidiaries that didn't have any real business operations. Every so often, a payment to an overseas account with no clear reason. I set the papers down and looked at her. How did you get all this public records property filings, some favors from old contacts, and a couple of sources who prefer to stay nameless? She leaned in slightly. The picture isn't complete yet, but it's bad enough to cause real damage if it's put in the right hands. The right hands, I repeated quietly. She nodded. There's someone I know, a journalist. Frank Miller. He's been chasing rumors about Whitford for years, but he's never been able to nail anything down. With this, and with what you got from Thomas, I think he could finally get it out in the open. I sat back, the hum of the diner fading behind the sound of my own thoughts. I had been picturing confronting Natalie and her parents face to face, but the idea of someone like Frank putting this in black and white for the world to see, that was a different kind of strike. Rachel must have seen something in my face because she said, "I'm not telling you what to do, Inane. But information like this has a way of disappearing if it isn't moved quickly. And if they get wind of what you have, they won't just sit back and let it happen." I glanced back down at the stack of documents. There was power in the neat rows of numbers and signatures, more power than shouting or arguments ever could have. I thought of Michael's text, of the way Natalie had looked at me like I was an obstacle. This was more than a way to get back into a wedding I'd been cut out of. This was a way to show them I wasn't the woman they thought they could dismiss. I closed the file carefully and pushed it back toward her. "Give me Frank's number." She smiled, just a little, the kind of smile she used when she knew she'd steered someone in the right direction. "I'll call him first. Let him know to expect you." We finished our coffees, and when we stepped outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of rain. I pulled my coat tighter around me as we walked to our cars. Rachel paused before getting into hers. 5 days ago, you didn't even know if you wanted to fight this. Now you've got more ammunition than most people ever get. Use it well." I drove home with the file on the seat beside me, the weight of it shifting with every turn. When I got back, I carried it straight to my office and set it down next to Thomas's folder. Side by side, they told a story that was too big to ignore. I pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the pad and wrote at the top, "Call Frank Miller." The next morning, I dialed the number Rachel had given me. A man's voice answered, low and steady, with the faint crackle of background noise like he was outside. "This is Frank Miller. I told him who I was and that Rachel had suggested we speak." There was a pause, then a short laugh. "If Rachel's sending you my way, you've got something I need to see." We arranged to meet that afternoon at a small cafe near the courthouse. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting at a table with a notebook open and a pen balanced between his fingers. He looked like someone who'd spent too many hours chasing leads that went nowhere, his face sharp with focus, but softened by the tiredness around his eyes. I set the 2 folders on the table. "These are from 2 different sources," I said quietly. "One's from a former employee, the other from a financial investigation." He opened the top folder, scanning the first few pages without rushing. Then he looked up at me. "Do you realize what you're holding here?" I nodded. "That's why I'm here." For the next half hour, he flipped between the files, asking questions about dates, names, and how I'd gotten them. When he finally closed the last folder, he sat, back, his expression more alive than when we'd started. "This is the missing piece. I've been following Whitford Luxury Group for 3 years. All I've had until now were rumors and a few blurry leads. But this ties it together." I asked him what he thought should happen next. "If you want this to have impact, you hit them when they're at their most exposed. Somewhere they can't control the room." He looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The wedding. All their friends' business contacts press. If you put this in play there, they can't bury it before it spreads." I thought about it, picturing the perfectly staged event Natalie's family would have planned. I could see the rows of guests, the flowers, the champagne glasses, and the certainty in their faces that nothing could touch them. The idea of breaking that certainty settled deep in me. Frank leaned forward. "I'm not saying it won't get messy, but you asked me how to make it count. That's how I agreed to think about it, and we stood to leave. He tucked his notebook under his arm and gave me a firm nod. Whatever you decide, I'll be ready. I was halfway home when my phone rang. Michael's name lit up the screen. I hesitated before answering. Mom, he said, his voice tight. I've been hearing some things. Are you talking to people about me, about Natalie's family? I kept my tone even. Why would you ask me that? Because I need to hear it from you, he said. Tell me you're not digging into something you don't understand. The silence stretched. I didn't lie, but I didn't give him what he wanted either. I've been keeping to myself, Michael. His voice sharpened. Don't do anything that's going to embarrass me or ruin this wedding. I mean it. If you pull something, you'll regret it. The line went quiet, then clicked dead. I sat there in the driver's seat, staring at the phone in my hand. His words didn't shake me. If anything, they solidified the feeling I'd had since the moment I walked into that cafe. He was afraid of something, and it wasn't just me showing up uninvited. I started the car again, the hum of the engine steady under my hands, and drove the rest of the way home with a new kind of certainty settling in my chest. The morning before the wedding, I woke early with the kind of clear focus that made every movement deliberate. I chose a simple but elegant navy dress, one that carried quiet dignity without drawing too much attention. On the bed beside it, I laid out my black wool coat and the leather clutch that would hold everything I needed. At my desk, I opened the folders from Rachel and Thomas and began sorting the most damning documents. I printed a few key pages, making sure they were clear and legible, then slipped them into a leather envelope I had kept from Peter's days in the sheriff's office. Its weight in my hands felt steady, reassuring. By mid-morning, I was sealing the envelope when I heard a knock on the door. Linda Cooper stood there with her phone in hand, her cheeks flushed from the cold. You need to see this, she said, stepping inside. She handed me the phone, the screen showing a photo from social media. It was the wedding invitation reposted by someone I didn't know with a caption about the guest list reading like a roll call of Charleston's wealthiest and most influential. My eyes scanned down the names, recognizing several from news articles and business journals. Linda tapped the screen. Everyone's talking about how exclusive it is. I handed the phone back, managing a small smile. Exclusive. That was one word for it. After she left, I sat at the table for a moment, the house quiet around me. The contrast between that list and the silence in this room was stark. Just after lunch, my phone buzzed with a text from an old friend I hadn't heard from in years. Heard about the Whitford Spa downtown closing without warning. Staff walked out yesterday. No final checks. The words made my pulse quicken. It wasn't just whispers anymore. Things were cracking in plain sight. I saved the message, knowing it would matter later, and glanced at the envelope on my desk. Every new detail made it feel heavier. The afternoon light was just starting to fade when I opened my laptop and searched for the wedding program. It didn't take long to find it, posted by one of Natalie's cousins on a public profile. I scrolled past the glossy photos of flower arrangements and menu tastings until I reached the formal printed order. There it was, bold and centered. Mother of the groom, Margaret Whitford. The space where my name should have been had been given to her without hesitation, without shame. I stared at the screen, feeling the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. It wasn't anger that rose in me, but something deeper, colder. They had decided who belonged to Michael in the eyes of the world, and it wasn't me. I closed the laptop, the click of it sounding louder than it should, and set it on the counter. The envelope waited on the desk, ready to be carried into whatever came next. The harbor wind in Charleston was cool that afternoon, carrying the faint scent of salt and magnolia blossoms, as I stepped out of the cab in front of the Harborview Hotel. The building rose above me with its whitewashed columns and wrought iron balconies, every detail polished for the photographs that would fill tomorrow's society pages. Valets in crisp uniforms opened doors for arriving guests, the street lined with gleaming black cars. I held my leather envelope close under my arm, feeling the weight of it like a steady heartbeat. Inside the lobby gleamed with marble floors and tall arrangements of white roses. The sound of a string quartet drifted from the banquet hall, blending with the murmur of guests already gathered. I walked through the arched doorway into the main hall, and was met with the shimmer of gold-trimmed tables, crystal glasses catching the light from chandeliers that hung like frozen bursts of fire. The air was warm with the scent of roses and champagne. Heads turned as I stepped inside. Some faces I recognized from magazine covers or news segments, others from the sharp memory of business profiles I'd read in preparation. Their eyes lingered on me just long enough to register curiosity before turning away, but the weight of their glances stayed. Michael was standing near the front, speaking with one of Natalie's uncles. When he saw me, his eyebrows lifted in surprise, but he didn't call out or cause a scene. Instead, he straightened his expression, tightening, and turned back to his conversation. Natalie approached from the side, her gown a sweep of ivory satin that moved like water under the lights. Her smile was perfect, almost warm, but her eyes told another story. "Mrs. Grant," she said, her voice smooth. "I'm glad you could make it after all. We have a seat for you just over here." She gestured toward a table near the center of the room and led the way without waiting for my answer. I followed each step, measured the envelope steady in my grip. She pulled out a chair with a gracious motion, and I placed the envelope neatly beside the place card bearing Michael's name. As I settled into my seat, I caught Michael's gaze from across the table. His eyes dropped to the envelope, and for the briefest moment, a flicker of suspicion crossed his face. He looked back at me, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. Natalie's hand brushed the envelope as she sat down. She glanced at me, her lips curling into a faint smirk, and lifted it with deliberate care. "What's this?" she asked, her tone light but edged. "A gift," I said evenly. "You should open it now." Her eyebrow arched, but she slid a manicured finger under the flap, the movement slow enough to draw the attention of the guests seated nearby. The rustle of paper seemed loud in the room's soft music. She pulled out a single folded note first, opening it to read my handwriting. "To remind you who your real family is." Her eyes narrowed slightly before she reached into the envelope again and withdrew the thick stack of documents. The paper was heavy, the print crisp, every page, a record of the truth they had tried to keep hidden. She flipped through the first few sheets, her movements still poised, but with a stiffness creeping in around the edges. Michael leaned over to glance at the pages, his face unreadable. I sat back, hands folded in my lap, and waited. The music played on, but at our table the air had shifted. I could see the muscles in Natalie's jaw working the controlled movements of someone suddenly aware they were on display. Michael's fingers tightened on the stack of papers, his eyes darting over the columns of figures and names. Natalie turned another page slower this time, as if she was trying to will the words to mean something else. A couple at the next table leaned in slightly, their curiosity barely hidden. One of them lifted a phone, the soft click of a camera shutter barely audible over the hum of conversation. I rose from my chair, the scrape of it against the floor drawing more eyes in our direction. The envelope lay open on the table, its contents spread between them. I kept my voice steady, but it carried across the room. "What you're looking at is where the money for this wedding came from. Dirty money." A ripple moved through the table's nearby guests, turning to glance at one another. At the head table, Margaret Whitford's head snapped up, her expression hardening as she pushed back her chair. "That is a lie," she said sharply. Charles was already standing beside her, his face flushed, his voice rising over the music. "Our family has built everything we have through honest work." I met their eyes without flinching. "The evidence is right there. Look for yourself." I gestured toward the papers in Michael's hands. Around us, more phones appeared, screens lighting up as people took pictures, some whispering names and numbers into each other's ears. From the corner of my vision, I caught sight of Frank Miller near the bar. His phone angled just enough to capture the scene. He was calm, deliberate, his attention fixed on the reactions, not me. I could see him noting every shift in expression, every denial, every moment that would matter later. Natalie set the papers down with exaggerated care, but her knuckles were pale against the tablecloth. Michael looked from me to his in-laws, his jaw tightening. Margaret took a step forward, her voice clipped. "This is slander and you will regret it." Someone across the room laughed quietly, the sound breaking through the tension for a split second. Then a tall man in a dark suit at one of the front tables stood up. I recognized him from legal news segments. Daniel Harper, a corporate attorney with a reputation for getting results. He cleared his throat. "If even half of what's in those documents is true, the IRS will want to see it. I can make that call." The room seemed to hold its breath. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line and Charles muttered something under his breath that I couldn't catch. A few guests were already sliding their chairs back, moving toward the door with their phones out, no doubt sending the images to anyone who would listen. I didn't move. I simply returned to my chair, the sound of whispers and hurried footsteps filling the space between the fading notes of the quartet. The damage was already spreading, and there was nothing they could do to pull it back. 3 days later, a knock at my front door broke the quiet of the afternoon. When I opened it, Michael stood there, his shoulders slumped, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. He was holding 2 large shopping bags, their glossy handles cutting into his fingers. Without a word, he stepped inside and set them down in the living room. "Natalie's gone," he said finally, his voice low. "She left Charleston 2 days ago." I closed the door behind him and waited. "The Whitfords. The IRS has already frozen some of their accounts. There's an investigation." His gaze drifted to the floor. "I guess you knew this would happen." He sat down on the edge of the sofa, his hands resting on his knees. I walked over to the bags and glanced inside. Diamond cufflinks, a gold watch, an embossed leather briefcase. Gifts I'd seen him open at the rehearsal dinner, all glinting under the light. He nodded toward them. "I don't want any of it. It doesn't feel right keeping what they gave me." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The tick of the clock in the hallway filled the silence. Then he looked at me, his eyes searching. "I'm sorry, Mom. I should have seen it sooner. I should have listened to you." He took a breath, his voice catching just slightly. I was so caught up in the idea of the life they were offering. I didn't want to see the cost. I sat in the chair across from him, my hands folded in my lap. "Do you remember the winter after your father died, when we had to decide between fixing the furnace and paying the mortgage?" His brow furrowed. "Of course. I remember you worked nights for months so we could keep the house." I nodded. "And I remember thinking then that family was about showing up when it's hardest, not when it's easiest." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I thought I was building something better for myself, but I see now. It was hollow." We talked for over an hour, the conversation moving between memory and regret. He told me about the pressure Natalie's parents had put on him, the subtle threats, the promises of connections and status, if he fell in line. I listened without interrupting, letting him sort through his own guilt. When the words began to run out, I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the late autumn sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the yard. "Forgiveness isn't forgetting," I said quietly. "It's keeping your eyes open and choosing to move forward anyway." Michael nodded slowly, his hands clasped together. "I understand." He rose from the sofa, gathering the bags but leaving them on the coffee table. "Take them to a charity," I told him. "Let them do some good for someone else." As he left, the air in the room felt a little lighter, though the weight of everything that had happened was still there, resting just beneath the surface. That evening I stayed in the living room long after Michael's car pulled away, the last traces of daylight slipping behind the mountains. The quiet felt different now, less like an empty house and more like a pause I'd earned. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a cup of tea, and carried it to the window seat in the front room. The sky over Asheville was streaked in deep orange and violet, the kind of sunset that makes you forget to breathe for a moment. My phone buzzed on the cushion beside me. It was a message from Frank Miller. "Whitford Luxury Group indicted this morning. Assets frozen pending trial." The words sat on the screen simple and unadorned, but I knew the weight they carried. A moment later, another message came in from Rachel. "We'll keep watching, but this is a solid start." "Good work, Eleanor." I smiled, setting the phone down. Before I could take a sip of tea, another text appeared. This one was from an unfamiliar number, but the name that followed made my heart lift a little. "Thomas Blake. Just wanted to let you know I started a new job today. Things are looking up. Thank you." I read it twice, the corners of my mouth softening. He hadn't owed me an update, but knowing he'd landed on his feet was a kind of quiet victory all its own. I reached over to the small side table and pulled open the drawer. Inside, the leather envelope lay exactly where I'd placed it the night before the wedding. I rested my hand on it for a moment, feeling the smooth grain under my fingertips. Then I slid it to the back of the drawer behind the photo albums where it would stay. I didn't need to look at those papers again to remember what they had meant. Outside, the air was cooling fast, the light fading into that soft indigo that comes before nightfall. I thought about the faces in that ballroom, the whispers that had started when Natalie opened the envelope, and how quickly the truth had moved from table to table. I thought about Michael's voice in my living room earlier, stripped of pride for the first time in a long while. There was no erasing what had happened, but there was room now for something different to grow. I leaned back against the window frame, letting the warmth of the tea settle in my hands. This house, this life still belonged to me. And I had done what I set out to do. Not to humiliate, not to destroy, but to make sure the truth was seen and could not be buried again. If it were you when your own family turned you away, would you stay silent? Or would you act?